Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of our podcast. Good morning from the United States and Buenos Aires, and from our folks in Europe and Spain. Today, we're going to be jumping right into one of the most important topics that we all rely on, which is energy and how it's dispersed throughout the world. So just a fun fact here is Europe generates about 40% of the electricity from renewable energies. And that's completely different in the United States, where it's just about 21%. So today we're going to be investigating on why there's such a big difference, what's driving those differences, and the current makeup of energy production around the world, specifically in Europe and the United States.
As you said, there's like a big difference between all the administration there behind all these politics. And nowadays all these green energy politics are influencing a lot into the citizens and the companies. So I think it's really interesting to see which are the most important resources, the energy resources, and how all these resources will change in the future and how the companies will adapt it.
Yeah,
So
it's an important topic. And I guess a good point to start is where we're currently at, the current breakup of energy in the United States. And then I'll pass it on to you to talk more about Europe and Spain in particular. But in the United States, relies heavily on fossil fuels. So about 61% of all energy generated in the United States is dependent on fossil fuels, which consist of natural gas, coal, oil, all of those resources that we've been relying on for decades. And only 21% is renewable energy. So renewable energy, we think of wind, solar, hydropower, biomass, geothermal, those type of energies, which are new in recent decades, but they're rapidly growing in the US. And I think we're lagging behind some other countries, but it's becoming a very popular source of energy. And then nuclear, which is the United States is the largest producer of nuclear energy globally. However, it is the third most used energy source in the US currently, behind fossil fuels and renewable energy. But also I think that's going to change soon, as there's been a big drive for nuclear energy to produce nuclear energy in the US.
Currently in the opposite side where we are here in Europe, because now our main goal is to invest on green energy, mainly because we are not really strong with fossil fuels, and most part of this resource is import from another countries. That's why we are focused on green energy, mainly green energy so far. But we import the fossils fuels, and we try to produce all the green energy we can. So here there's a big difference. But what we've seen here is that there are like some geography points to have in account. So we don't have barely reserves of fuels, and in US, so it's the contrary.
Yes, like completely different. And that's a good point. Geography really drives, I think, the reason why Europe and the United States use such different energy sources. Like you mentioned, Carlos, like a lot of the energy is fossil fuels are imported into Europe. So Europe needs to rely more on renewable energy compared to the US, where we have states like Texas, Oklahoma, Alaska, Pennsylvania. It's very rich in oil, natural gas, and coal.
Yeah.
And that also drives the politics. So I think politicians in Europe have a different viewpoint. In the US, we have a representative democracy. So a lot of the folks in Congress are in power. They have to represent the people, and the people have jobs working in coal mines and oil fields and producing natural gas. So they drive the politics of it to support fossil fuels and
Okay.
over renewable energy.
Yeah. So we have to have in account two things, like the geography position of every country. And from this point, every country make his own strategy. So we've seen that US is focused on fossil fuels, at least in the short term, and in the European Union, and they are more focused on green energy so far. But at the end, we see that in overall, the main international strategy is to change this into a new green energy strategy altogether.
Yeah, bring together the global community. And also, Carlos, I'm curious, in Europe, it's a benefit to have a European Union because I think you get to rely on your neighbors more. Do you know which countries produce the most of the certain types of renewables? I know France has a big reserve of nuclear energy in particular.
Yeah, here in Europe, countries like Norway, England, these are the only, next to Russia, these are the only one that produce fossil fuels mainly. And apart from this, France, for example, is the country where there are more nuclear plants, and they rely on this kind of energy. And we can see that in the south of Europe, they are trying to invest on solar panels. And yeah, at the end, there are too many hours of sun, so they have to take the advantage. And particularly in Spain, we try to invest a lot in green energy because of two facts. We don't have any fossil fuels reserve, so most of the fuel is imported from outside. And in the other hand, Spain is in the south, and also we can take the advantage and liberate all this solar energy and also this wind energy.
Okay. Yeah, I think Europe is is the most innovative in green energy. I even saw some articles that in Germany they're putting solar panels on their balconies and using different mechanisms
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. For example, here in my neighbor, I'd say more than the 60% is investing on this kind of energy. But also we have to take in account that this is an investment for people. You don't recover the investment in 10 years. For example, the payback is around 10 years. So at the end is, I think this transition to the green energy is first expensive, and secondly, you need time to recover the investment, and also you need time for the people. Like people need to adapt all the system and also all the infrastructure,
Right. Yeah, and that's one of the things in the US we struggle with is there's a vision. I think both in the political spectrum, and both Republicans and the Democrats, they both believe in investing in green energy, but they have a different view on how much to invest in green energy. For example, the Democratic Party has a more aggressive approach to transition to green energy quicker, faster, put more money into it. And the Republican Party is saying, let's do that, but at a slower pace. So that's one of the big topics in the US is how quickly we should be moving and what
Yeah,
mandates, regulations should be put in
yeah,
place.
at the end, it depends a bit about the strategy you want to have. Because at the end, okay, if one company is going to invest on green energy, and the P&L of the company will be affected this year, also the next year, and they will have a worse results, for example, in the S&P 500 or
500.
in the market. So it's hard for companies to rely on green energy, at least in the short term.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's a good segue because now that we know where Europe and the United States stands in current energy production, let's talk more about the future and the approaches each region is taking to move to a green energy future. So when we speak about green energy, it's clear that we're talking about renewables, natural sources like solar, wind, hydropower, but it's also worth noting that it's the goal of shifting towards green energy is to produce as little as possible of emissions and reducing the environmental impact. So there's more of the goal is to reduce climate change
Yeah.
and sustain life as we know it.
Yeah, and so far there are a lot of methods and a lot of strategies with green energy, but nowadays there's a big issue. For example, okay, we know how to produce electricity, but how about, for example, all the batteries that the cars use or all the materials that we are using to produce all this green energy? So we need to have a plan to arrange everything and make it the more efficiently way possible.
Yeah. And one of the big changes in the US is we've gone from, okay, this is an issue, to how can we address the issue, to realizing that the best way is to set standards. So in the US, the individual states, we have a federalist system where the states have a lot of power. And then the federal government obviously has more power than the states, but the states are the innovators. They're kind of the laboratories of democracy. They're able to set their own standards for the most part in the US and innovate. So you would see different policies in California as you would in Texas or Florida, for example. That's
Okay.
what
Yeah,
we're seeing.
and yeah, I was thinking like, for example, these states are able to influence on another states close to them, for example.
Yeah, so that's one of the good things about the system in the US is if a state does something very well, another state could look at, for example, education. If they're doing something in their education system that's working, other states could copy that system. Or if it works for many states, then the federal government could adopt that policy if it's popular enough.
Yeah, okay. I imagine that they influence on countries with the same political party or with the same ideology, or maybe not.
Yeah, I think some countries like the United Kingdom or countries with similar systems as the US or at least similar ideologies, they may bounce ideas off each other of what works. I know specifically in the climate change and the green energy realm, a lot of the ideologies to push for green energy is we look at what other countries are doing, especially in Europe, because I think Europe is the leader in green energy at the moment.
Yeah, here we can say Europe like kick off all the process, and so and now I think like the most difficult part is to have the necessary consensus. How do you say consensus, or the necessary support of countries?
Consensus?
Consensus? Yeah, exactly. Because it's really hard because every country has different interests, so and different strategies, and here it's difficult. In Europe maybe it's a bit easier because most of the countries of Europe take part of the European Union, and here we have a really strong consensus. But outside this, it's a bit more difficult. If you wanna make an agreement, for example, with China or US or another country, I'd say it's really hard. And you have to incentivize these countries to do this. So you have to give something.
Yeah. And specifically for Europe, I know they had initiatives that like the the Green Deal targets, net zero emissions by 2025, and so forth. Are there any big initiatives that you're aware of that's driving policy in Europe?
Yeah, for example, we have like a regulation that in 2030 any fuel car can be produced, but I'm not sure if this will be make reality because
Enforced?
maybe it's too soon, I think.
Yeah, and even you were telling me in Madrid, it's more difficult, or they're starting to charge money if you drive certain cars in the city.
Here in the European Union, cities with a certain population have several constraints and limitations. So, for example, here in Madrid, the population is around 6 million. Just in the hub of the city, cars in 2006, less. I mean, like all the older cars cannot go to this area.
Wow. Yeah, that's unique. That's unique to the European Union. In the US, we don't have that. New York has one of the first, I mean, actually very recently, in the late 2024, they implemented a regulation where they're actually going to start charging fees for cars to drive in Manhattan. So that's just one of, like, there's differences in Europe and the US. And I think the states, more progressive states, are starting to adopt similar regulations as what's in Europe. But yeah,
Yeah,
that's
and at the end, this is possible because when we join the European Union, we seize part of our sovereignty, and now we decide all together these kind of decisions, ideally for a better organization.
yeah. And I know we talked a lot about government regulation. So, and what exists in Spain and the initiatives governments are starting to do. But that also has a big impact on the private companies, because private companies now are being forced to comply with regulations to make sure they're thinking about green energy and how to reduce carbon emissions from your largest corporations like BP, the oil producer, and all the way to Apple, how they ship their products to be net neutral carbon producers by X date. Normally 2030 is a big one. So, for example, BP is rebranding and they're cutting their oil and gas production. They're aiming to cut it by 40% by 2030. So it's just an example of how, and I don't know if you have more examples from Europe, how the policies, government policies and the attitudes are impacting private corporations.
Yeah, the example you mentioned, it's perfect. And here we have a lot with, for example, with companies that produce products. Now the European Union is, for example, is aiming to produce with certain materials or producing with less plastic, with less energy. And we've seen how these companies has to adapt all the structure, and otherwise they will have fines, even some fines.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I assume it's a lot more regulated in Europe than it is in the US.
Yeah, so like it's not only issue of okay, I don't wanna do it. It's my decision. Like if I don't do it, I will lose money and I will lose the profitability.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's even having an impact on the people. You could make arguments that it's coming from the top down, like government setting regulations which are impacting the corporations. But I think an even stronger argument is that it's coming from the bottom up. I think a lot of the younger generations, like Gen Z and late millennials, and even people, they're being more cognizant of the impact that we're making on the government, on society, and on the world. And I think they're being more active. We're taking a stance that's positive for the future of the world. And I just want to touch on some of the big initiatives that I think grassroots initiatives from people using their voices on social media and lobbying governments and so forth have made at a global level. So there's a couple initiatives that I think 2 or 3 that we want to talk about. The first is the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals, and specifically number 13 is targeted on climate action. So that's a big one because the United Nations represents all the nations in the entire world. So they're actively pushing for green energy policies, strengthening resilience in countries, integrating climate policies, education, awareness, and so forth. And then another one is also the impact investing. Is there anything you want to talk about for like green energy projects that are being implemented in Europe, or how it's
About the investing, do you mean?
yeah, or has it been more common to invest in companies that promote green energy and less reliance on fossil fuels in Europe?
I'd say that so far the green energy companies don't transmit the necessary confidence so far, but I'm sure in some years, because at the end, like, I think people need to see results, and in the short term it's a bit difficult to see them, but in the long term maybe these companies will be more safety, the number of investments will be higher, but so far they are not investing too much, and this is a bit difficult to change, at least in the short term.
Yeah. I think one thing that Europe does really well, especially in the United Kingdom, is they're using initiatives like green bond initiatives. So investing in financial instruments that are targeted to hit specific goals, like supporting companies that report on their climate emissions and do have very good reporting. I think that's something that the US adopted, specifically large banks such as JP Morgan and other institutions are starting to actually have departments and have specific reporting to make sure they're hitting climate goals and so forth. So,
Yeah, at the end, in the European Union has a really strong background in the sense of achieving goals. It doesn't matter if it's a green energy goal or a finance or a military goal, for example. But so from the beginning, we've been improving this process. Like, okay, we got this goal, we tried to achieve it, we made the strategy all together, all the countries, and here with the green energy, I think it's the same. It only changed the topic.
and I think lastly, so we talked about the UN Sustainable Development Goals and then impact investing in private corporations. I think another area that we're seeing a lot of global adoption is in the Paris Climate Agreement, the climate accords. I know the US recently pulled out of the climate accords, but I think
Yeah, I saw it.
but I think it's still the goal of the agreement still remains intact, and it was signed by 195 countries, which is no easy feat to do, but it's has specific targeted goals such as limit global warming, keep the rise in global temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius, reducing carbon dioxide emissions, and then financial climate action aiming to provide $100 billion per year for climate initiatives and submitting them for countries every 5 years to submit their progress towards these initiatives. So that's just a summary of what it does. But I think, needless to say, that energy is so important because it impacts our daily life to speak to each other electronically, to power everything. It's interesting to see the geographic and the political dynamics between the US and countries in Europe, especially Spain, and to see where the future is headed. I think overall, there's a future for green energy is going to increase rapidly.
Yeah.
The appetite is there, and policies are going to reflect that. And the people are really driving the policies. People are more aware that what we do today impacts our daily life in the future. Climate, ensuring that we're aware and making progress towards green energy goals is really important. And I assume you feel the same about the appetite in Europe as well.
Yeah, pretty much the same. And yeah, I think at the end we've progressed a lot in the last years. Although the pollution continue and everything, yeah, and at the end the population increased every time more, and it's difficult to upset this. In the future, the population will be um, like a lot. I don't know the percentage, but we have to have this in account and implement these all strategies to achieve all the goals.
Yeah. Yeah, completely agree. So I hope you enjoyed this episode where we explored the current energy structure in around the world and the initiatives for green energy. And Carlos and I are excited to
Yeah,
speak about it and also to discuss more topics, more global topics from the perspectives of Europe, Spain, and the United States in the future. So stay tuned for the next episode.
and I'm sure we'll speak more about this topic because it's really huge.
Yes, I agree. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you at the next episode.
Okay, see you next time, Mitchell. Bye.